Did you know that Tyranids can make hybrids with plenty of other races? Genestealer cults are just the most famous one. However, there's one other example that I could find that I think would be incredibly awesome, which is the Ork Tyranid Hybrid. For this project, I'll be using a box of Hermagons. For my Ork, I opted in for the feral looking one from Age of Sigmar. Using a 40k Ork did cross my mind, but I couldn't find a good way to make it work. Initially, I planned to use a box of Genestealers instead, however, they were out of stock at my local store, and in hindsight, I prefer it this way. When selecting the class, I chose a pair that would be a closer match to his pose, and enhance the feral look. For the head, I went for the one without a horn as it seemed to be a better match for the hybrid aesthetic. This piece was the catalyst for the entire project. I wanted to create a really cool weapon for this Ork a while ago, however, I got inspired to transform him into a full hybrid instead. I carefully snipped off his weapon and also made sure to leave behind some of that rope that I think will look much more authentic. Instinctually, I wanted to go for a classical scythe look, however, I remembered that historically, scythes are actually straightened out to increase their lethality. I also thought that increasing the angle would make this weapon look a lot more unique and stand out against the other models that use scythes, and pulling out some plastic glues. With it, all the pieces should be fused into a permanent bond, and I'm not gonna have to worry about one of them accidentally snapping off during the painting process. And because I'll be using sprue glue, I'm not gonna have to worry about additional fillings, as it will seal the gaps when attaching the pieces together. The Dwarf Scythe already looks deadly, mighty, and above all, awesome. Moving on to modifying the head, ironically, I expected this to be the quickest part of the project, but I drastically underestimated how difficult it is to hold this piece. I used my massive head trimmers to trim off as much of the head as possible, yet with each snip it became more and more difficult to hold this tiny little piece. Next up, I grabbed the X-Acto knife and scraped away as much of it as I could. Somehow ended up looking more like an admiral's hat, and I wasn't making a freebooter, so I shortened it by one plate. Then came the big cut. I was quite nervous about it since I only had one chance to get it right. Fortunately, I was quite patient with this part, so it worked out. After measuring the two pieces, I thought that removing one additional plate would make it look a lot better. This way, the Tyranid chitin is the same size as his head, hopefully creating a much more natural appearance that will make it seem like it actually belongs in the model. With a bit of sprue glue applied to the piece, the head was finally done. With the difficult part out of the way, I moved on to attaching the claws. To my surprise, attaching them was the easiest part of the entire kitbash. All I had to do was just simply remove the tiny little peg and pick a good spot for them. My original place for them was going to be underneath his arms, but I thought that placing them back would actually make a lot more sense, as this would give a lot more freedom of movement to his main arms. Now, to make sure this Ork wasn't lonely, I decided to give him a little companion. Orks usually hang out with a bunch of grots, however this guy is gonna have a little tapeworm companion. Besides looking really awesome, I also think the base will be able to provide a much more interesting story this way. Afterwards, I considered some additional mutations like using the tail from the Hermagon, and I also thought about giving him an additional carapace on his back. But that felt a little bit like I would just be attaching a Hermagon to his back. Instead, I used the Genestealer skull on the base to hint at the origin of the Genestealer virus, inadvertently doing a callback to the fact that I wanted to use Genestealers for this project. For my primer, I wanted to try something a little bit different. I mixed purple ink with gray and black primer and applied it through an airbrush. Now, you might be wondering, how is it possible that we can see a purple Ork? That's all thanks to the fact that I got my hands on some Dark Age technology. Now, if you enjoyed the kitbash, don't forget to give this video a like, but for now, we need to get to the most important part of the process, which is gonna be painting the model. Things got off to a great start with me mixing some green paint and began applying my layers. I used a tiny amount of purple in my green and eventually transitioned to a pure green, without any purple inside of it. And I really enjoyed how it was turning out. Unfortunately, I made my first big mistake, and I jumped to a brighter green a little bit too quickly. Instead of catching this early and going back, I decided to try to go even brighter instead, with my intention being to smooth out the differences later. But the realization that I was making a mistake was beginning to settle in. I grabbed some Plague Bear Flesh contrast paint in hopes of smoothing out some of those details. It was beginning to work a little bit, and it gave it slightly of a yellow hue, so I grabbed some Agrol's Dunes thinking that I could shift it even further into the yellow tone. What I didn't realize was that this paint was acting a little bit differently and it just wasn't turning out well. So I mixed up a different green this time, adding a bit of ochre into it to give it a slightly of a yellow hue. I was making much smoother lines in hopes of getting rid of that awful texture that ended up creating. Additionally, I added some water to the layer that I thought looked the best and applied it essentially as a thin glaze. With this, hopefully creating a smoother transition between the shadows and the harsh of those highlights. I learned a valuable lesson that just because that texture works really well on something like armor, it does not mean it will transition really well to something like flesh. For my highlight, I decided to accentuate his muscles and all the details in the miniature. At times, I was a bit uncertain where to apply the highlights, so I used the side of my brush to allow the miniature to guide to the areas. Then I tried something drastic and applied that contrast paint of Militarum green through the airbrush. I was holding the miniature upside down to create sort of a reverse zenithal highlight. This worked incredibly well at smoothing out the transitions between my shadows, not to mention it created a very interesting definition to some of the muscles. Mixing in a bit of red together, I created the idea that he has very red gums, as in theory, orcs technically have red blood, and using some of the highlight I used for his skin to give him these very yellow nasty looking teeth. These tiny little details are often something I overlook on some of my miniatures, however I started to notice that giving them a little bit of attention can go a long way at making the model look more interesting. For my scales, I knew that I wanted to go for a very dark purple color, similar to what I see in the box art for Tyranids. I tried using the Citadel paint that comes in the Tyranid box set, however, it wasn't really looking like what's on the box set. I tried to build up a few more layers to see if it will start looking a bit more accurately. That wasn't really working out, so I tried mixing in some of the magenta to create a color that's much more accurate to what's on the box. Yet the more I worked on them, the more I realized that I just did not like the way it was turning out. So I tried something a little bit different. I grabbed some of the purple ink I used for the primer and applied it all over the scales, but I still couldn't tell why the scales were not looking the way I was expecting them to. So I decided to get my mind off things and work on some of this hard wood. I mixed up a very yellowish tone brown just to contrast really well with the purple. And for the leather of his tunic, I went for a very similar color. However, the difference there is the fact that when I started applying my highlights, I went a bit brighter on the yellows, while keeping the shaft of that hard wood a little bit darker. But the more I looked in the miniature, the more I just realized that it was looking incredibly monotone and boring by just being green and purple. So I mixed up a bit of this very desaturated looking red and I began applying it to all of the weapons. And as I began applying the red color, I started to notice that the model was finally looking interesting. I was so hyper focused on the green and purple to make this a Tyranid-Ork hybrid that I entirely forgot to use other colors. This gave me a creative boost to play around with some different colors, so I tried applying some orange, and then for my tips I airbrushed a little bit of white. Now the color of these blades made me think of a praying mantis, so I decided to hold into that aesthetic. With some Imperial Fist contrast paint, I began to smooth out the transitions between the colors. Then at the center, I used Gorgranta fur to create a much more concentrated color. To bring even more attention to these blades, I accentuated them with a little bit of white at their tips. With these blades looking so eye-catching, I decided that I need to try something a little bit different for these scales. I took speed paint Grim Black and created my favorite acrylic wash. With this, I wanted to hone in on a much more contrasted aesthetic for the miniature. I took on quite a large risk and applied it to the rest of the miniature as well. And I was incredibly careful at spreading out that wash to avoid any concentrated areas. The orc skin was finally looking the way I originally envisioned it, however I still wanted to spend some additional time on it. So I dedicated an additional 30 minutes just on that final highlight. I knew that these scales were simply not on par with the rest of the miniature. So I took one last ditch effort at applying some highlights to the scales, and I realized that this was simply not working. I went nuclear and took some ultramarine paint. I was entirely focusing on the warm hues on this miniature, and I entirely forgot to include something cold. And as I finally began working through this ultramarine color, I realized just how awesome it looked. The model finally had a good balance between the cold and the warm colors, not to mention had an extremely awesome looking contrast. With the final highlight, I finally knew this miniature was done. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like, but for now, let's see the final result.